February 19, 1944, the underground command bunker at Rabaul, New Britain. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's fingers shook as he bent over his private journal, committing words to paper that would have meant a firing squad if Imperial headquarters ever discovered them. The Americans are not fighting us. They are strangling us. Each garrison we hold but cannot defend becomes another anchor dragging the Empire down into the depths. From the narrow ventilation shaft above his desk, he heard it again, the steady rumble of B-24 Liberators passing overhead. The same sound, day after day, as predictable as the sun rising. The Americans had decided Rabaul wasn't worth attacking, so they simply flew past, leaving 100,000 Japanese troops, the cream of the Imperial Army and Navy, stranded on this volcanic rock, watching helplessly as enemy convoys sailed toward Japan. Rabaul had once been magnificent. The fortress had been developed into a major fleet base, the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific. Now it was being neutralized without a single invasion attempt. What terrified Kusaka more than any suicidal charge or naval bombardment was what he was witnessing, a completely new kind of war that made every Japanese defensive strategy worthless. The Americans refused to play by the old rules. They didn't want glorious battles. Instead, they were methodically dismantling the Japanese Empire through systematic neglect, converting strength into weakness, turning fortresses into prisons. The arithmetic of defeat wasn't written in casualty reports, but in shipping manifests that never arrived. In airfields where zeros would never fly again. In soldiers who would perish not from American bullets, but from hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of irrelevance. The Japanese had conceived their Pacific strategy in the pristine offices of Imperial General Headquarters with elegant logic that appealed to military minds. Every island fortress would serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Every garrison would be a sharpened blade aimed directly at the American advance. The Americans would be forced to assault these positions, bleeding themselves dry against Japanese steel and fighting spirit. Lieutenant General Hidekito Joe himself had declared in September 1943 the establishment of the Absolute National Defense Zone, a defensive line stretching from the southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, through the Bonin Islands, the Marianas, Western New Guinea, Malaya and Burma. Every strongpoint would be held until the last breath. Every island would become a fortress. Americans would pay in blood for every meter of territory. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura commanded 50,000 elite troops from the 8th Area Army. The harbor was bristling with 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields could launch hundreds of aircraft. The complex included Lakunai and Vulakunai, the pre-war Australian strips, plus Rapopo, operational since December 1942, with concrete runways and extensive maintenance facilities, and Tobaira, completed in August 1943. Miles of underground tunnels connected defensive positions to hospitals and supply depots carved directly from volcanic rock. Rabaul is impregnable. Imamura had written to Tokyo in November 1943. The Americans will shatter themselves against our defenses like waves breaking against stone. What neither Imamura nor anyone in Tokyo understood was that the Americans had absolutely no intention of giving them their glorious battle. The pattern became apparent in June 1943, disguised as American timidity. When American forces landed on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands on June 30th, Japanese commanders initially rejoiced. These islands barely had defenders. Clearly, the Americans lacked the courage to assault real Japanese positions. Captain Toshio Takahashi, the intelligence officer at Rabaul, documented this in his analysis. The enemy lacks the stomach for heavy combat. They nibble at the edges like mice, afraid of the lion. Yet something about the pattern gnawed at Takahashi. The Americans weren't simply grabbing undefended targets, they were deliberately selecting islands where they could build airfields. Woodlark and Kirawina were positioned perfectly to provide air cover for operations that had absolutely nothing to do with attacking nearby Japanese strongholds. The troubling picture grew clearer when American forces invaded New Georgia on June 30th, 1943. The Japanese garrisoned the island with 10,500 troops defending the critical airfield at Munda Point. This would be the real battle. But after weeks of brutal fighting that stretched through August, The Americans secured the airfield and then simply stopped. They didn't chase the retreating Japanese forces. They didn't attempt to clear the entire island. They took what they needed and then moved on. Major Kenji Hatano, who endured the New Georgia campaign, submitted his report to Rabaul in shock. The Americans fight in a way we don't understand. They take what they need and abandon the rest. It is as if we don't matter to them. By November 1943, the pattern became horrifyingly impossible to deny. The American offensive, designated Operation Cartwheel, wasn't aimed at capturing Japanese bases at all. It was aimed at rendering them useless. Admiral Mineichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had responded to the Allied invasion of Bougainville by rushing carrier aircraft to Rabaul. On November 1, 1943, he transferred 173 carrier aircraft, 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance planes, from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyo, Hio, and Ryuho to reinforce Rabaul. These were Japan's last experienced carrier pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the British at Ceylon, and fought at Midway. They represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a base the Americans had already decided to leave alone. The American response came swiftly and with devastating force. On November 5th, carrier aircraft from the USS Saratoga and USS Princeton struck Rabaul hard, heavily damaging 4 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. On November 11th, they returned with the Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence, damaging nearly all remaining warships in the harbor. But what happened next began the slow psychological collapse of Japanese commanders. The Americans didn't invade. They didn't press their advantage. They simply sailed away after destroying 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft and killing 82 of 193 aircrew members. Commander Yasuo Kuhara, a Zero pilot who survived the November battles, wrote in a letter found after the war, "We won. We drove them off. So why does it feel like we lost? They damaged our ships, shot down our planes, and sailed away. We cannot chase them. We cannot strike back. We can only wait for them to return." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, senior staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, began recording what the bypass strategy meant in concrete terms. His classified reports, captured after the war, showed a chilling mathematical progression of strategic strangulation. November 1943, Rabaul receives 30,000 tons of supplies monthly, fuel reserves at 60%, ammunition adequate for 6 months of combat. December 1943, supply convoys grow increasingly difficult. American submarines sink 2 vessels for every one that arrives. Monthly deliveries drop to 18,000 tons. January 1944, no surface vessels have reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. Only submarine deliveries. 2,000 tons this month, fuel reserves at 30%. By February 1944, Japanese High Command made the grim decision to stop sending fighters and bombers to Rabaul, recognizing that reinforcing an isolated garrison made no sense. The mathematics were absolute. Without supplies, even the mightiest fortress becomes a prison. Captain Takayo Takagi, commanding a destroyer squadron at Rabaul, faced an impossible calculation. He possessed fuel for perhaps one major operation. But where could he possibly go? The Americans had seized the Admiralty Islands in February 1944, completing Rabaul's total encirclement. Every direction led to enemy-controlled waters. "We are a fleet that cannot sail," he wrote, "warriors who cannot fight. We have become military theater, performing the pretense of power while the real war moves on without us." What the Americans had discovered, whether through strategic genius or plain luck, was that Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by nature itself. Each bypassed island became a green hell where the jungle, tropical disease, and starvation accomplished what infantry divisions would have cost in blood. Dr. Shigeaki Yamuchi, chief medical officer at Rabaul, documented the steady decline of combat strength. December 1943, malaria cases increasing, medical supplies adequate, quinine reserves for 4 months, combat readiness 85%. March 1944, 30% of garrison suffering from malaria, dengue fever or dysentery. Quinine exhausted, substituting local bark with limited effectiveness. Combat readiness 60%. June 1944. Malnutrition is now the primary concern. Rice rations cut to 400 grams daily. Soldiers supplementing with jungle plants, many poisonous. 17 deaths from toxic vegetation this month. Combat readiness 40%. The Americans had weaponized time itself. Every day that passed weakened Japanese garrisons while American forces grew stronger, leaping from island to island, constructing airfields and ports, building an infrastructure of victory, while Japanese strongholds decayed in tropical isolation. On Wake Island, bypassed since October 1943, Captain Sakaibara commanded approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. Once a vital refueling point for trans-Pacific flights, Wake had been transformed into a fortress, bristling with coastal guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and underground bunkers. The Americans simply ignored it completely. Sakaibara would be promoted to Rear Admiral only in October 1944, but by then his command was already meaningless. Sakaibara's reports to Tokyo, transmitted by submarine radio, grew increasingly desperate. November 1943, enemy carrier aircraft struck installations, awaiting invasion force, all positions manned and ready. January 1944, no invasion occurred. Enemy ships pass by weekly, beyond range of coastal guns. Request instructions. April 1944, food situation critical. Fishing provides some relief but insufficient for garrison. Many men showing signs of malnutrition. When will relief come? On Vole Atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese troops under Major General Katumi Kitamura experienced similar abandonment. The Americans had seized nearby islands for airfields but left Kitamura's garrison to slowly wither away. His diary, recovered after the war, chronicles the psychological unraveling. March 31, 1944. The enemy task force sailed past again today, close enough to see through binoculars, but beyond reach of our guns. They don't even consider us worth destroying. May 15, 1944. Received radio message that all available forces are being concentrated for decisive battle. We are not included. We have become military orphans. August 2, 1944. Men have begun cultivating gardens. This is not warriors' work, but survival demands it. I fear we are becoming farmers, not soldiers. The American carrier raids that periodically struck bypassed bases served a purpose beyond military damage. They were psychological operations designed to remind Japanese garrisons of their complete helplessness. At Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, approximately 27,000 troops and the Fourth Fleet had created what strategists considered an impregnable bastion. On February 17 to 18, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force conducted massive air raids that destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons, and killed 4,500 Japanese personnel. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding at Truk, experienced a commander's worst nightmare: irrelevance. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters revealed the psychological impact. The American carriers appeared without warning, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished. We could not pursue. We could not retaliate. All we could do was sit tight and patch things up, fully aware they'd be back whenever they felt like it. This wasn't fighting in any real sense. It was slow, grinding torture. That same cruel pattern kept repeating itself all across the Pacific. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap. Each one got hit by American carriers, just frequently enough to wreck any serious defensive planning, but never enough to give Japanese commanders the kind of straight-up battle they wanted. Saipan in July 1944 showed exactly how brutal this island-hopping strategy could be. When American forces hit the beaches on June 15, 1944, they came with staggering power. Over 300,000 men crammed onto more than 500 ships. But what actually kept Japanese strategists awake at night wasn't the invasion of Saipan itself. It was all those other strongholds the Americans hadn't touched. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded Saipan's defense, and on July 6, 1944, He got his final report before leading the last Banzai charge. The picture it painted was devastating. Across the entire empire, forces were paralyzed. Truk had 27,000 troops cut off with zero naval support possible. Rabaul held 100,000 men, stuck there, reduced to farming vegetables. Wake had 4,000 troops marooned and surviving on whatever fish they could catch. Marcus had 4,000 men, stranded with a critical water shortage. Wally had 6,426 troops, with starvation closing in fast. Over 200,000 Japanese troops sat there with thousands upon thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, and massive fortifications. Yet they were powerless to do anything while Americans pushed toward Japan. These weren't combat losses, they were something far worse. Fighting men and equipment had become anchors, dragging Japan down instead of strengths. When Lieutenant General Tadamechi Kuribayashi stepped onto Iwo Jima in June 1944, he carried with him hard lessons learned from watching the bypass campaign unfold. He saw immediately that holding Iwo Jima was impossible. The Americans would definitely come here to Iwo Jima on their way to Japan's mainland, and that invasion would happen soon. Unlike commanders before him who dreamed of victory, Kuribayashi planned something different: how to make defeat cost the enemy as dearly as possible. He'd seen what happened to garrisons left behind and understood the strategic math completely. Rather than putting defenses on the beaches to stop landings head-on, he chose a different approach: defense in depth. He ordered his men to dig 18 kilometers of tunnels and carve out 5,000 cave positions throughout the island. In a letter to his wife, one he never got to see her read because he'd be dead before it arrived, Kuribayashi laid out his thinking. "I don't fight expecting to win because that's not possible. I fight to make the Americans pay so high a price that invading Japan starts looking different to them. Every Marine we kill here is one fewer who lands on our home islands. We're not really defending Iwo Jima. We're defending Japan through our deaths." This was a completely new direction for Japanese military strategy. Kuribayashi actually banned Banzai charges except as a final act, seeing them as wasteful, and told every soldier to keep fighting and stay alive as long as possible before being killed. The bypass strategy had taught Japanese commanders a bitter lesson. That dramatic death meant nothing unless it served a real strategic purpose. What those commanders were slowly grasping was that the Americans had transformed warfare itself. The island-hopping strategy wasn't simply about skipping hard targets. It represented something far more revolutionary: a completely different way of managing military logistics that made traditional defenses meaningless. Commander Chihei Takahashi, a staff officer who studied American operations, wrote an analysis that Tokyo suppressed. The Americans aren't just taking islands, they're building floating bases. Each captured atoll becomes a fuel depot. Every lagoon and anchorage, every airstrip becomes another arm of their power projection. They've turned the entire Pacific into a supply route for their war machine. Liberty ships were pumping out 3 vessels every single day at peak production. While Japanese garrisons measured out their final bags of rice in tiny portions, American construction crews poured concrete for runways capable of handling 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind behind Pearl Harbor, watched American supply operations from his desk in Tokyo and drew a terrifying conclusion: we trained to be warriors. They trained to be engineers. While we perfected dying beautifully, they perfected getting supplies where they needed to go. Every garrison we leave behind weakens us. Every new airfield they build makes them stronger. The clock itself has become our worst enemy. Alongside the island-hopping strategy came the American submarine campaign, turning Japanese attempts to resupply into death sentences. By 1944, American submarines were destroying Japanese ships faster than Japan could build replacements. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, commanding submarine operations from Truk, documented how impossible it had become to help bypassed garrisons. January 1944 saw I-169 sunk while trying to resupply Bougainville, 40 tons of supplies lost. In February, I-43 took damage from aircraft near Rabaul and had to abandon the mission. March 1944 brought I-42's loss during an evacuation attempt from Wake Island. By April, submarine resupply missions stopped. They couldn't justify losing precious boats just to deliver minimal supplies. The submarines that had once connected the scattered garrisons with Tokyo became too valuable to risk on such hopeless runs. Each isolated fortress truly stood alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, that June 1944, revealed just how catastrophic the bypass strategy had been for Japanese naval aviation. Japan had already lost 121 of 173 experienced carrier pilots defending Rabaul, leaving the fleet stripped of its most skilled aviators. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the mobile fleet into an impossible position. His carriers were crammed with green pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours in the air. The veteran instructors who could have trained them were dead or trapped on forgotten islands. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19 and 20, 1944. The Japanese lost between 550 and 645 aircraft. 3 fleet carriers went down, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, and roughly 3,000 men perished. Americans lost 123 aircraft with 109 killed. The 10-to-1 kill ratio told a story deeper than simple American superiority. It showed Japanese degradation caused directly by the bypass strategy. In his report afterward, Ozawa wrote words that cut to the heart of Japan's predicament. "We have carriers without pilots, pilots without training, and no chance to gain experience. The enemy strategy has done more than beat us in battle. It's made it impossible for us to ever become good enough to win." By the middle of 1944, something surreal was happening on bypassed islands scattered across the Pacific. Thousands of soldiers, men trained for years in combat, were becoming farmers fighting just to survive. At Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have sounded insane just 2 years before. Starting now, all units spend half their daylight hours growing food. Every soldier tends 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders get judged on farm output, not how ready they are for combat. Imamura grasped that Americans planned to starve them out rather than fight them. The mighty fortress of Rabaul, built to threaten operations across the entire Pacific, had become a massive prison garden. Colonel Norio Kishimoto commanded an infantry regiment and wrote in his diary about the humiliation eating at his soul. "My warrior ancestors would hang their heads in shame watching us now. We trained to fall beautifully in glorious battle, but instead we're growing sweet potatoes and raising chickens. The Americans didn't just beat us in war, they've beaten us into irrelevance." The same heartbreaking scene played out everywhere. Soldiers on Walae raised pigs, men at Truk improvised fishing nets and cast them into the sea. On Wake, they scratched at coral sand mixed with waste, desperately trying to grow anything. The Imperial Japanese army that had conquered half of Asia was reduced to scraping dirt for survival. The cruelest part was how long it took bypass commanders to truly grasp their reality. Radio messages from Tokyo kept coming. Orders were still issued, promotions still announced. The pretense of military importance continued, even as the actual situation slipped further into nightmare. As late as December 1944, General Imamura at Rabaul was still getting operational directives from Imperial General Headquarters. Prepare for coordinated offensives tied to Philippine operations. Stay ready to hit American supply lines. These orders asked men who hadn't seen a supply ship in 8 months to somehow conduct offensive operations. The gap between what Tokyo believed and what was actually happening on those islands had become completely impossible to bridge. By April, the last submarine had abandoned Rabaul. The last surface ship had sailed away. For over a month, no aircraft had managed to take off. As 1945 arrived, the bypass strategy entered its most merciless phase. Without any formal campaign targeting them, American bombers struck the gardens that starving garrisons had cultivated for survival. B-24s hammered those gardens. Fighter sweeps machine-gunned the boats they used for fishing. Even the struggle to simply survive was denied them. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, serving as an agricultural officer at Wally, recorded the devastation. 6 months of work, gone in 10 minutes. Corn we grew from seeds, vegetables we watered using our drinking water, all burning now. The Americans didn't bomb our gun positions or ammunition supplies. They bombed our food. They knew exactly what they were doing. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, roughly 300,000 Japanese soldiers remained scattered on bypassed islands. Rabaul alone still held 69,000 men when Japan gave up. These soldiers had survived not through fighting, but through gardens and fishing and slow starvation. Surrender created a bizarre situation. Many garrisons refused to believe the announcement, convinced it was an American trick. Others accepted it, but faced a different problem entirely. They were on islands with no Americans present. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mille in the Marshalls faced this strange predicament. The war's finished, but we've got nobody to surrender to. The Americans bypassed us so completely, they practically forgot we were here. Now we just wait and hope they remember us eventually. Some garrisons sat there waiting weeks or even months for Americans to finally show up and accept their surrender. During that time, they existed in an eerie in-between world, neither at war nor at peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, later thought back on what they'd accomplished. The fastest way to beat Japan wasn't fighting Japanese. Every bypassed island meant thousands of enemy soldiers we didn't have to kill, ammunition we didn't have to fire, American lives we didn't have to spend. We took their own strength and turned it back on them. General Douglas MacArthur, though skeptical about bypassing strong positions initially, eventually saw the strategy's genius, especially after bypassing Rabaul prevented terrible Allied losses. But the assessment that cut deepest came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, writing in his February 1945 diary. The Americans found the perfect answer to the Japanese warrior spirit. They made our courage irrelevant, our strongholds useless, our Bushido code meaningless. We got ready to die with honor. They sentenced us to live shamefully. This is worse than defeat. This is erasure. The mathematics behind the American island hopping strategy tell a chilling story about its devastating reach. Japanese forces found themselves bypassed at Rabaul. What started as 100,000 troops dwindled to just 69,000 at surrender. Truk held approximately 27,000 troops. Walaei contained 6,426 soldiers. Of those, only 1,650 survived to surrender. Wake Island garrisoned 4,000 troops. Marcus held another 4,000. Various other outposts scattered across the Pacific each held their own contingents, tens of thousands more across all these positions combined. The total was staggering, an estimated 300,000 Japanese troops simply neutralized without any major combat ever taking place. The strategic success rate speaks volumes. Of the 26 major Japanese bases that were bypassed, not a single one managed to pose any real threat to American operations after being cut off from the homeland. The real genius of island hopping wasn't found in military victories at all, but in something far more profound. It was psychological warfare on a scale the Japanese military had never encountered. This strategy shattered everything the Japanese had believed about warfare. Their doctrine had always centered on one fundamental principle: seek out decisive battle where spiritual superiority would overcome any material disadvantage. The Americans flatly refused to cooperate. They simply didn't show up for the fight. Japan had invested decades fortifying islands across the Pacific, pouring resources into elaborate defensive systems. But the Americans revealed something revolutionary. Fortifications only mean something when someone actually attacks them. The entire Japanese military culture had been built around the glory of dying in combat. But what happened when no combat came? They were sentenced to survive in irrelevance. Japanese military philosophy taught that superior will could triumph over material shortage. The Americans made will itself pointless. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo served as an intelligence officer on Marcus Island, one of those bypassed positions. His post-war analysis captured the deepest truth of what had happened. "We were ready for American strength," he wrote. "We anticipated their technology. We were completely unprepared for American indifference." They found something the Japanese warrior could never fight against: being forgotten. By the time 1944 drew to a close, some Japanese commanders had finally begun grasping this new reality and trying to adapt. But by then the game was already lost. Lieutenant General Tomoe Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied how the island-hopping campaign unfolded. He designed his entire defense around this new understanding. His goal wasn't victory. Instead, he aimed to make winning so terribly expensive that Americans might hesitate before invading Japan itself. He rejected the old ways completely. No frenzied banzai charges, no desperate attempts to hold the beaches. Instead, his troops would fight from an intricate network of underground tunnels. This represented a fundamental break with Japanese military tradition. Kuribayashi understood what island hopping had taught him. A defensive position's only real value lies in the price it extracts from an attacker who chooses to assault it. His approach stretched what military planners expected to be a 5-day battle into 36 grueling days. The cost was enormous. Nearly 26,000 American casualties fell, with 6,121 killed. Even commanding General Holland Smith acknowledged Kuribayashi as a formidable opponent. Okinawa in 1945 showed this same adaptation to island-hopping lessons. Japanese defenders didn't try to push back the invasion. Instead, they sought to make the price so steep that America would negotiate peace rather than invade the home islands. The deepest irony of the entire strategy was how it weaponized Japan's own warrior code against itself. Every bypassed garrison that refused to lay down arms, every soldier who chose death before dishonor, every commander who followed orders to hold their ground at any cost. They all became trapped in their own making. Americans had assumed these isolated garrisons would quickly crumble. Many confounded those expectations by simply enduring, cultivating gardens, and coexisting with local populations. What might have seemed like admirable survival instead meant prolonged suffering and meaninglessness. General Masatane Imamura reflected deeply after the conflict ended. "We trapped ourselves with our own code," he observed. "Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was forbidden. So we simply remained. The Americans didn't really need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves through our inability to adapt to their strategy." For the soldiers in bypassed garrisons, the war's conclusion brought confusion rather than relief. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Matome Kusaka formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard HMS Glory. But they were accepting the surrender of forces that hadn't mattered militarily for over a year. Smaller garrisons experienced even stranger fates. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to accept that the war had ended. They continued fighting against an enemy that no longer existed, maintaining this vigil until 1951. Military discipline remained intact. Patrols continued regularly. They prepared for an American invasion that had been cancelled 6 years prior. These holdouts represented the psychological warfare's ultimate conclusion. Their military purpose had been so thoroughly negated that they could no longer imagine a world where they simply didn't exist anymore. The island-hopping strategy inflicted a uniquely vicious form of suffering. Combat, despite all its horrors, carried meaning with it. Dying for the emperor, sacrificing for the nation, these offered cold comfort and purpose. The bypassed garrisons were denied even that grim consolation. Private Kusunoki Maki, stationed at Woliai, captured this existential horror. "We do not fear death," he wrote, "we fear meaninglessness. Every morning we wake and conduct military drills for battles that will never happen. We maintain weapons that will never be fired. We pretend to be soldiers when we are actually prisoners of our own code. Medical records from bypassed positions paint a desperate picture. Malnutrition affected 80% of troops. Disease rates exceeded 60%. Psychological breakdowns became common. Suicide rates climbed sharply compared to combat units experiencing active fighting. The island-hopping strategy permanently transformed warfare itself, far beyond World War II's scope. It demonstrated that holding key geographic points didn't automatically mean controlling an entire region. Traditional military thinking was completely overturned. Americans proved they could dominate the Pacific while essentially ignoring its strongest positions. The strategy showed that superior supply lines and industrial power could neutralize any tactical advantage an enemy possessed. Time itself became a weapon. By accelerating their own operations while constraining the enemy's movement, Americans weaponized the passage of time as a strategic tool. Beyond all else, the strategy proved that psychological damage could exceed physical destruction. In 1965, 2 decades after Japan's defeat, the former general Hitoshi Imamura released his memoirs. Following his conviction for war crimes, he had constructed a replica of his prison cell within his own garden and inhabited it until his death in 1968. Every dollar earned from his writings went to families of Allied prisoners who had perished under his watch. His professional and personal assessment of island hopping cut to the core truth. We studied Napoleon, we read Sun Tzu, we trained for every type of warfare our minds could conceive. The Americans invented something entirely new that we never anticipated. Warfare through avoidance. Victory achieved through irrelevance. They converted our greatest strength, our willingness to die defending our positions, into our most devastating weakness. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. We possessed ammunition for years of sustained combat. Our fortifications could withstand any conceivable assault. Our determination to fight until the last breath burned fiercely. None of it mattered. The Americans sailed straight past us toward Japan. We could only watch helplessly. We became an army of phantoms, haunting positions that had lost all meaning, defending territory with no strategic value, waiting for battles that would never materialize. This was their brilliance. They forced us to defeat ourselves. Every day we held our ground weakened Japan's position. Every soldier tending gardens at Rabaul was a soldier unavailable to defend the homeland. We weren't defeated, we were erased. Future military strategists should examine the American island hopping strategy, not primarily for tactical skill, but for strategic innovation. It proved the crucial lesson that the most effective way to neutralize an enemy position isn't to attack it directly, but to render it irrelevant. The true path to winning a war involves redefining what victory means. We terrified ourselves with our own helplessness. Throughout our lives, we had prepared for glorious death in combat. The Americans imposed something far crueler, meaningless survival in isolation. No warrior code prepares you for irrelevance. We carried traditions spanning centuries, fighting an adversary from the future. They didn't neutralize our strategy. They rendered strategy obsolete. This was the true horror of what island hopping represented. It forced us to confront that everything we believed about warfare was fundamentally false. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, providing the most poignant example of island hopping's psychological devastation. Deployed to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with explicit orders never to surrender, Onoda persisted with 3 companions until he alone remained. On March 9, 1974, his former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, traveled to Lubang and officially released him from duty. Onoda surrendered on March 10, 1974, his rifle still operational, carrying 500 rounds of ammunition, wearing his 30-year-old uniform without a tear. When people asked why he had endured for so long, Onoda offered a simple answer. I was waiting for the war to return to me. I never imagined it would simply abandon me forever. The Japanese feared America's island-hopping strategy because it represented something more terrible than defeat. It embodied meaninglessness. Every military tradition, every cultural principle, every strategic conviction was weaponized against them. They prepared for a warrior's conflict and encountered instead a war directed by engineers and logisticians who treated island fortresses as nothing more than obstacles to navigate around, rather than enemies to engage. Approximately 300,000 Japanese troops across bypassed islands didn't merely lose a war. They were excised from it. While they held their positions, cultivated their gardens, and slowly starved, the war proceeded without them. They weren't conquered. They were discarded. They weren't defeated. They were ignored. In his final notation before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul recorded a devastating truth. The Americans have revealed the cruelest lesson of warfare, he wrote. Something exists that is worse than dying in battle, irrelevance despite victory. We were the Emperor's supreme warriors, relegated to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed toward the homeland. We trained our entire existence for glorious death. Instead, we endured meaningless life. Their ultimate weapon wasn't explosives or ammunition, it was obsolescence. The island-hopping strategy achieved victory because it targeted not Japanese positions but Japanese purpose. It attacked not bodies but beliefs. It assaulted not fortifications but fundamental convictions about what warfare truly is. The Pacific Ocean transformed from a battlefield into a highway toward triumph. Japanese strongholds shifted from fortresses into prisons of their own design. The terror it generated came not from what it accomplished, but from what it deliberately didn't do. It offered no battle for warriors to embrace. It provided no validation for their sacrifice. It didn't even acknowledge their presence. It simply moved past them, permitting them to gradually comprehend that for a warrior, the worst conceivable outcome isn't death, it's irrelevance. The Empire's warriors learned that the setting sun projects the longest shadows. In those shadows, forgotten armies gradually disappeared into emptiness, conquered not by their enemies, but by their total absence. They witnessed the future of warfare firsthand. In that future, they had no role to play.